Good evening everyone and welcome to this code-based session. Today is Sunday the 6th of January 2019 and I'm currently broadcasting from Olympia in West London. So today we'll take a look at the creation of your student portfolios, and this is exercise 50 of Z.A. Shaw's Learn Python 3 the Hard Way. So let's jump right in. Z.A. Shaw mentions that the last three exercises are actually quite hard and therefore you should take your time with it. So first of all, there are a couple of requirements for this exercise, and in this exercise you're essentially going to build a web version of your game, and for this you'll need to have completed exercise 46 before you can actually proceed. Secondly, you'll need to have a working version of pip, and thirdly, you'll need to be able to create a skeleton project. So if you haven't got all of these foundations, make sure that you have them before attempting this exercise. And now I'm actually going to show you something that I've put in place for you to create your student portfolio, just making things a little bit easier. And if you open up a new tab on your browser and you go to the URL, which is essentially, I'll give you the URL. The URL that you want is your username. So your username, whatever that is, okay? So just substitute that with your username. .codebase.tech. So my username is codebase, so I'll say codebase.codebase.tech, and that's what we're currently viewing here. Okay. Now we're just seeing essentially a kind of an empty portfolio site, a codebase.tech member portfolio, and a place to display your work. Deploying the portfolio site, in the terminal, simply run deploy portfolio. And that kind of does the heavy lifting for you. And if you simply run this and you select, for example, Flask, then this has now set up your Flask portfolio site. And in fact, if I go back to codebase.tech, codebase.codebase.tech, I may need to just refresh this. Go back to my terminal, and now do a refresh. It says greetings to the world from Flask, and this is actually a Flask enabled website that's powered by Python, therefore running in your home directory. But I'll show you the basic setup of how that works, and then we'll do it the way that's actually recommended in the book. So inside your home directory, you'll notice that you now have a portfolio directory with a Flask site, and aside of there you have Flask site.py, and this contains really the bare bones of a Flask website, which is it imports Flask and it creates an application. It has a route called Hello World, and then we just have some basic HTML that we return as the response, and that's essentially what we are seeing here. And some other things to look out for as well. If you go inside your the root of your home directory, you should now be able to see a file called autorun.sh. And autorun.sh first of all exports Flask debug. If you set that to 1, then each time you make a change to Flask site.py, the change will get reflected immediately. Otherwise you'll need to refresh your terminal for that change to actually take effect. And here we start the Flask website, and that's really all there is to it. But now that I've done this, I'm actually going to undo this and do it the way that's prescribed in the book. So I'm just going to delete this autostart.sh and then do rmrf portfolio, and again I'll refresh my terminal to relaunch my my Linux container. And now when I go to the portfolio website, we go back to the default one. Another thing to bear in mind about the portfolio website is that if you create essentially let's try the HTML version, deploy portfolio, HTML, OK, exit. Now this time your portfolio URL, which is username.codebase.tech, will pick up the HTML version, and the HTML version actually overrides everything else. So even if you have a Flask website or Django website running inside your home directory, if you have an HTML directory with index.html, which is the default HTML file that's looked for by the vast majority of web servers, then that HTML file will override everything else. And if I make a quick change to it, this is my Codebase HTML portfolio page, and I refresh, I can now see that change there. Okay, and hopefully this is something that you can build up to the point where you'll be able to set the link to your friends or your prospective employers or whoever you want. This is something that you now have. It's a web presence, which is definitely something which I think is quite important when you join a coding class. You want to have some deliverables at the end to just make it a little bit more real, to make it a little bit more concrete, that you actually learned how to code and now you have something to show for it. So your deliverables at the end of this course are going to be your portfolio site, which we're looking at now, and in some future videos I'll also show you how to set up Git in your home directory, open up a GitHub account, and essentially put your code up onto GitHub once again so you can display it to the world. So let's remove this portfolio directory once again, rmrf portfolio, and as we can see, this has now gone back to what it was before. And I'll now go back to where we were. So in the book, we start by activating a virtual environment. So let's go back to the shell. And I don't know if I still have my virtual environment. So I do have a virtual environment, so I can do source.vnvs, learn Python the hard way, bin activate, and this activates my my virtual environment. The install Flask section, Zedishore tells us that essentially there are many web frameworks, and that a web framework is essentially a Python module, for example, and people actually built up their own sites using Python directly, and as a way to make things easier, they built their own web frameworks, and as a reason, there are many different types of web frameworks, and you can start off with Flask, and once you become more comfortable, you can switch to other ones, or you can actually stick with Flask. And what I can tell you is that you know, I do lots of web development, full stack web development, and that includes lots of back-end web development. And I can tell you that Flask, when combined with some other technologies such as UWSGI, Nginx, etc., is actually really good, and it's definitely, you know, good enough to do really the vast majority of anything you'll ever encounter in back-end web development. And he begins by making you do a pip install Flask, but we don't actually need to do this because I've pre-installed Flask and Django inside our Linux environment, and later on, if we want to do some development using Node or, you know, Golang or whatever we want, then I'll also pre-install these environments so you don't have to go through that process each time. You can actually confirm that Flask is already installed by doing which Flask, and that's installed in user local bin Flask. Okay, so even though, you know, that step is listed in the book, we don't actually need to do it because I've pre-installed it now. Now, making a simple Hello World project, we'll go inside cd projects ll mkdir Gothon web. And I'm wondering why we're not copying the skeleton, but never mind. mkdir Gothon web. cd Gothon web, mkdir. I'll make the font a bit smaller so we can actually see it, and I'll do it clear as well. Mkdir bin Gothon web tests docs templates. Next, touch Gothon web init dunder init, that's 2 underscores init 2 underscores .py, and then touch tests slash init .py. And now we'll be taking the game from exercise 43 and making it into a web application, and that's why we're calling it Gothon Web. And before we do that, we need to create the most basic kind of Flask application, and we'll do that inside app.py, okay? App.py. And I'm wondering if app.py should be inside this Gothon web directory, but he's not saying that explicitly in the book, so never mind. We'll just move it later on if we have to. So I'm just going to say touch app.py, switch back to my editor, and open up projects, Gothon web, app.py, and type this out from Flask import Flask app equals, make the font bigger so you can see it, app equals Flask underscore underscore name underscore underscore, and then an @ sign, and that's a decorator. That's something that we haven't discussed yet. Okay, decorator app.route, and that's the root directory. So essentially, when you open up a website, when you're at the root of that directory, remember it's all about roots. It's the same as a file system. Then you're not at, like, let's say on Facebook you would say groups / codebase tech, and that would be the root for that. Now we're just in the root, and def hello world greeting equals world, return pardon me, f hello greeting, and finally if name equal main app.run. And I'm not sure whether you are actually familiar with this. I can't remember whether we've covered it or not, but essentially this simply says that you should call app.run if and only if this Python script has been invoked directly by Python. If it gets loaded up by a module, then name is not equals main, and therefore we won't call app.run. And now to run the application, I'm not sure whether this is going to work for us. Oh, there we go, it does. So I would have used Flask directly, but yes, you can invoke it directly inside Python 3. And now, as you can see, serving Flask app, and running on localhost. So that's the URL for the current machine, port 5000. Okay, and what I've done is that I've used some various technologies to map port 5000 to your URL, which is once again your username.codebase.tech. And interestingly, yes, this is not mapping. It's not mapping, and that's because this is only serving your machine. This is only serving your current machine, and we need to make sure that it actually serves more than just your machine. It needs to serve the whole world. So, if your computer, if your phone, if any computer in the world goes to the address of your portfolio site, it should be able to serve it. Whereas now this is saying only serve the current machine that the application is currently running on. So the way that we'll mitigate this is actually quite straightforward. Let's go back to the application we were typing out earlier, and we'll simply say host equal 0.0.0.0, and that means any IP address. And in case you're wondering what an IP address is, then simply Google it and you'll see that IP addresses are a way to refer. It's like an address, it's like a home address for your computer, okay? And this says any address, any host can actually connect to this now. So let's save this. Let's go back into the terminal and run this once again. And now you can see, instead of serving 127.0.0.1, we are serving all IP addresses. And yes, we can confirm this. We now have Hello World inside our portfolio website. So let's actually break down a little bit more what's going on, because as you can see, indeed, we now have this this portfolio site powered by Flask and Python running in your home directory. And when we go to this portfolio site, we can see that it's indeed working. But let's think about the actual steps that are taking place. And one thing worth mentioning is that every time I hit refresh on this portfolio website, we can see these GET requests coming through with status code 200, and status code 200 means that indeed the request was successful. And I can also see my current IP address here. Okay? That means the IP address on the internet of the machine from which I'm currently broadcasting. Now, the steps that are taking place are that initially the browser makes a network connection to well, in this case, not your own computer. It's actually making a connection to the codebase.tech, server. Okay. It connects to codebase.tech. Actually, it connects to, again, your username.codebase.tech, and your username.codebase.tech is actually stored in something that's called a DNS, and that stands for a domain name server. And a domain name server is essentially a big database with addresses that map to IP addresses. Okay, I should say with names that map to IP addresses. So what I mean by that is that google.com, that has an IP address. In fact, google.com has got hundreds of IP addresses. Many different computers will actually handle this thing, but when you make a query to Google's DNS, it just gives you an IP address, and that handles your request. And in the same way, facebook.com, that has an IP address as well, and youtube.com, etc., that also has an IP address. And now your student portfolio, believe it or not, username.codebase.tech, that also has its own IP address, and DNS servers are now aware of your username.codebase.tech, which is why now when you type that address inside your web browser, it takes you to the right place. And if you wanted to, you could even register your own domain. So you could say, for example, I have shile.com, or if you wanted to have essentially your name.com, then you could very easily map that to your student portfolio. You could actually map that to your student portfolio. Yeah. And so it does that to the this IP address, which is now stored inside the DNS server, and it looks for essentially anything that's serving on port 5000. Port 5000, and that's because at a given address, you can have tens of thousands of ports open because you can have many different services all running on the same machine, and in our case, the portfolio sites are being served on port 5000. Now, once that connection has been made, once it connects, it makes an HTTP request to app.py. And I'm sure you've heard the term HTTP, and that stands for Hypertext Protocol, and it's the protocol of the web. That's why you have to type HTTP and HTTPS in front of web addresses. And sorry, it's not app.com, it's app.py. Obviously, that's being served up by Python. And it's making the request for the root URL, which again is like the common URL for the first URL upon which you land once you reach a website. Now inside app.py, we have a list of URLs, and it looks for the right one to match. And indeed, this root URL matches index, although I'm not too sure if he means index or if he means hello world, because in fact here we have listed this as hello world and not index. Okay, and so Flask looks up at your def hello world, which happens to be mapped on the root. And your def hello world takes a request and then handles it and returns what should be displayed. So, we start handling the request here once we enter def hello world, and essentially we return the request here on return hello world greeting, and then that what we're returning gets sent back to the person making the request, and that's why we give it hello world as a result. Okay, now make sure that you really understand all of these processes, and I know it's lots of new information, but that's really only theory. Okay, so make sure you kind of wrap your head around this theory before pushing on. Let's try actually breaking things. Let's just delete this one line, the greeting equals world line. Okay, save this. Let's go back to the console, do Control C, and then launch this again. And let's carry out a request by refreshing this, and now we get this internal server error. The server encountered internal error and was unable to complete your request. Either the server is overloaded or there is an error in the application, which kind of brings lots of flashback of the kinds of messages that I'll see when I'll be in client sites. Very, very, very common. Okay, and now you just need to kind of look here, scroll through the output, and you can see in the end it says line 6, return hello greeting, and name greeting is not defined. So that's actually quite helpful if you do have an error and this is status code 500, then you can actually just look at your output and understand where the error is coming from. And that works well enough, but there's another mode, which is the debugger mode, and that's actually the mode where I showed you earlier how to do it once you set up your own Flask site on auto-run mode, etc. And again, we'll go through doing this manually. We'll say export flask underscore debug equals 1. So we're setting an environment variable called flask debug, and we're setting it to 1. And now let's start this again. And as you can see, it says debugger is active. Now if I run this, I'm actually going to get more output and to the point where I can see what my error is directly in my student portfolio. Okay. And once again, when we are in debugger mode, when we make changes and fixes in this case, they are reflected instantly. So now when I refresh, things work and it says hello world. If I say, you know, hello codebase, refresh, it says hello codebase. And just to kind of whet your appetite, let's say, you know, a comma dot join and a list, and I'll say A, B, and C. So if I run this, we are declaring a list with ABC strings inside of it, and then we are joining them with a comma. And now it says hello ABC. If I say join star str of x for x in range 10, save, go here, I get hello 0 until all the way up to 9. So as you can see, we are just writing some Python code, and it's really interesting that we can now map Python directly into a web application. I think it's actually quite neat. Now let's take a look at actually using templates, because as it mentions in the book, you know, maybe you noticed that this does not actually make a great website, and the way that you would make a great website is to actually write some HTML and then serve up that HTML and have a method to add some data programmatically into that HTML. Now what we're going to look is a very Pythonic way of doing that using templates. And not just Python, many different languages do use that exact method, but generally when you're looking at like really modern web applications, they tend to use something called Ajax. And you know, one thing you should know about web development is that it's really big, it's really broad. So I don't want to bring you into Ajax yet, because it's obviously way too early, okay? But just know that there are many different paradigms, and using these templates is really just one of them. So let's create a templates directory, and again, I'm not too sure whether I'm actually saving that in the right directory, but it doesn't matter. We can always move it later on. Actually, I'm pretty sure. Let's move it now. Yeah, so let's go inside our terminal, Control C this, clear ls, and I'll move app.py inside. Oh no, it is in the right place. My bad. We are in the right place because the templates directory is here. So now I'll do touch templates index.html and go back into our editor, open up templates index.html and type out HTML So I don't know if you've done any HTML, if you've written any HTML in the past, but essentially this is XML. And in XML, the syntax is that you start these markers, okay? Because it's a markup language. You start these markers with these arrows pointing in each direction, and that's to open a marker. And the way that you close a marker is the same thing, but with a slash at the start. And then sometimes you can have some markers that also end like this, and I'm sure that we'll encounter them later on. So we start with HTML, and then I'll copy this twice, and I'll call this head, and I'll indent this, okay? And then we have title, gothons of planet Percal number 25. Title, and I'm really sorry, the syntax highlight here is still Python. My IDE is not smart enough to see this is an HTML file and give it HTML highlighting. I will fix that soon. And that's for the header, okay? And the title is literally the thing that goes inside the thumbnail inside Google Chrome. And now I'll say curly brace if greeting curly brace, sorry, %sign curly brace, okay? And that's what a conditional looks like in this template, in this Flask templating language, okay? And now, and if I just wanted to say, and now we'll add an emphasis tag, em style equal, and style is what you use to style any element, okay? Any element that can be styled, and you style it using CSS. And I'm sure that you've heard the term CSS before. So the color will be green, and the font size 2em, which is essentially saying I want the font size to be twice as big as it would normally be for that browser rendering on that device. Because remember, browsers are really ubiquitous. You know, they can run on laptops, they can run on phones, they can run on fridges, they can run on tablets, they can run on anything. I mean, you know, browsers and web applications are actually like the most ubiquitous applications that you can find these days. And that's why, you know, people keep on saying the web is the future, the web is the future, because, you know, the more we progress and the more we keep on you know, developing and creating devices that connect us, the more it makes sense for everything to just end up, you know, in 10, 20, 50 years, maybe, I mean, your operating system will just be a web browser, your operating system will just be Chrome. I mean, look, there's already, you can buy laptops that are called Chrome OS that are really focused around web, and it seems like that's where everything is kind of converging, that's the web. Alright, so we then have, we need to close our emphasis tag, yes. So here we'll put our greeting, and be very careful because these are two different styles of template definitions. So here we have a curly brace with a %sign where we actually have a conditional if, and then we end the conditional with end if. And here we actually have two curly braces where we are inserting data. So just bear in mind that these are actually not the same, okay? Greeting and then /em, and then we have, instead of end if, we'll have else, and here we'll have em hello, close emphasis, world. And sorry, I missed the body tag. Obviously this isn't a body tag. Body, and we'll just end the body here. And that looks alright. That looks alright. I think I would indent this. He does not in the book, so let's do it like he does in the book. And that's our template HTML file. Okay, so let's go back inside app.py. Let's go back inside app.py. And the small change that we are going to make is from Flask import render template and then greeting, let's remove this. Oh, let's keep it, it's fine. And instead of saying return format hello world or hello greeting, we'll say return render template index.html, and then greeting equals greeting. Save that, and remember that we are in debugging mode, so let's see if it managed that, and indeed absolutely no problem, no, sorry, I'm lying. that's actually the one that I set up. So let's go inside our terminal, see what happened. Yes, not running. It's not running. Python 3 app.py. There we go. Yeah, that's more like it. I just wanted to say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Very good, very good. Now, the final section, we are going to discuss, I think, once again, sort of what's going on here. So once you have that in place, reload the web page on your browser, and you should see a different message in green. Okay, and you should be able to do view source. So if you right-click on your web page and say view page source, you can now actually see the results that's been rendered out by Flask. Okay. So this is the main flow, and let's talk about how templates work. So in your app.py, you've imported a new function named render template, okay? If you look here, you can see from Flask, import render template, and that actually knows how to load an HTML file, which is assumed to be inside the templates directory. Okay, that's like the default setting for the Flask application. And then later on in the code, when the browser hits def hello world, then instead of just returning greeting as we were earlier, it calls render template here, and it passes greeting as a variable. Okay, we want to load index.html inside the templates directory, and then we pass greeting as a variable. And this render template method then loads up index.html, and it processes it. And in this index.html, as you saw, there's some code here. Yeah, there's this logic once again, and then here we are accessing the variable. We are accessing the variable, and essentially these are acting as guards. So if you don't pass in greeting, it's not going to crash. So now that you've got this set up, and now that you've seen how to kind of, spawn a portfolio very easily, and you've also looked at how to do it the manual, hard way, keep on making some changes. Make sure that you kind of get comfortable with what's going on, what's happening, and one thing to bear in mind is that if you look at how I automatically deploy the portfolio website, you'll see that with autorun.sh, as long as your container is running, then your portfolio site is always going to be up. And if you were to just put this code inside autorun.sh, then you'd get the equivalent. So you can also study that, make sure you understand how to make sure that your student site is always up and running. And so guys, that's really it for exercise 50, and as always, I hope that I made it a little bit easier for you than just following the book, and I hope that you enjoyed this whole experience with the tooling as well. And let's see if we do the study drills. I'll be waiting for some feedback from you, yeah, let me know how you get on. So thanks for your time, and I'll speak to you in another session. Bye bye.